like we want to know and we want to collaborate and um, on the one hand, and then there's also practice, like we work with like literally every team in a 450-person office. So we are like 14 people, and we are like like sponges, like kind of soaking up knowledge from both ends. On the front, on the one hand, like from research, on the other hand, from practice, and so that's what the seminar is loosely based on. It's not about our experiences, but it is about like tracking like this kind of research and practice applicability across several technologies. So and that's how we also see computation and design. There's a lot of computational technologies, but we obviously have to apply it to do something useful, not just learn things for the sake of learning them, but like how do we make use of this? Like how can we actually make people's lives better by designing better buildings? What is better buildings? It could, first and foremost, that like people like it, people can use it, uh, and it uses less material or less energy. So you define what is better, obviously, and um, but like how, but always look to use technologies that you borrow or you learn from other disciplines, even things like AI or machine learning or robotics. Obviously, none of this was started in architecture. It like started elsewhere, but we want to know how we can apply all of these within architecture. Okay, so I will take a pause here and kind of invite questions or uh, suggestions, or if I'm speaking too fast, too slow, any specific things you are curious about that we may address in one way or the other. Um, so the aim of the seminar, I mean, I have a definitive structure. I will cover topics such as 3D printing, technical topics like 3D printing or origami, but also like kind of show examples of like how other how it has been applied, at least in practice. A few examples and other buildings. So that's the broad scope of the seminar, to track knowledge histories of knowledge that is embedded in the built environment. So yeah, yeah, questions, comments, suggestions. Hey, definitely. I didn't pick you out. Anybody who turns on their camera, I say hello. Hey, Shu. Um, yeah, so well, maybe so we'll have these interactive webinar type things, and already have pre-recorded the entire lecture, so you in 10-minute increments, so you can go through that. I will upload that on the Teams. So so I might or might not go through the entire lecture now in the webinar format. Um, and so like the intention is that like we use this somewhat conversationally, and so I can point you to maybe more relevant um, reference, or even within the references, like specific topic domains. So maybe I'll start off with the question: what do you guys? I mean, obviously you applied and wanted to be at the DRL. So what what do you guys think of when you think of design research or computational design? because obviously we are not researching. I mean, any research that we do involves a computer. So whether a robot is also a computer in some sense. Physical research involving robots, digital research involving a computer. So there is some form of a machine that you instruct. So what do you guys think about when you say design research? What do you have in mind?
Maybe I can talk about computational design in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are two ways to go about it, or the way I see it being used in the field.
Mm-hmm.
One is the aesthetic, like
Mm-hmm.
just using computational design to make cool designs, which
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is using it to solve problems, just like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think that's like the one I'm interested in, and it
Mm-hmm.
seems like the DRL is doing that in a way.
Mm-hmm.
We introduce a problem and then we try to solve it. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Anyone else has comments about yeah, like so there's always, which is a peculiar thing that like any new technology, like obviously there's always a aesthetic use of it. That's the music part that I said. Oftentimes like you definitely need to get pleasure from just doing it for the sake of doing it. Otherwise, like you don't have the motivation to learn enough, like to then use it to solve problems. And so we should always welcome new sensibilities and new aesthetics, because it's a source of inspiration. It's a source when you have to solve problems. You obviously need like resource, right? Like you need to know how to draw new things, because those new things will help you solve maybe a structural problem, or maybe it'll help you solve a spatial problem. Obviously you won't directly solve poverty, but like you can solve material use or something like this by by learning new ways to draw, new ways to construct. And so initially it is definitely necessary to experiment and like with new aesthetics. And even modernism that we see all around us now, like every building you see is probably modernist. It started with pavilions, people like Mies van der Rohe, or like the Barcelona pavilion, or like almost every movement in architecture starts with kind of pavilions. And that's for a reason, because you don't want to directly make a building while you're experimenting. So that's where, like, I often think of it as music and language, or like any painting versus actually using painting to make a movie, or things like this. So once there is communication involved, then it is already solving a problem. Yeah, so hey, Jonathan.
Hey, hey, how are you?
Good. Anyone else? What do you guys think? Or what attracted you to DRL specifically?
I can ask a question, maybe.
Yeah.
I totally agree with Yara, of course, for these two directions in computational design. I was just trying to think about what optimization is, and this is a topic that kind of confuses me lately, because it seems that we are often referred to optimization and optimizing the form and optimizing the building. So yes, I wanted to listen to your opinion about what optimization is, how optimization is considered finally successful or not successful, what makes it successful or not successful. And yeah, how much is it a point or a target for architecture? Because it seems that we are often referred to that, and it might not be the total, I don't know, destination to architecture to be always fully optimized. I don't know. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, fair. Yes, and that's a fair observation, and that oftentimes that uh, the word is well, let's say not misrepresented, but like kind of has a narrow use in the sense of engineering optimization. Obviously means like you use less material or you use less energy, right? Like so, or like something to do with like making something less minimum or maximum, right? Like so you want, for example, you want to maximize utilization or minimize heat gain, or like minimize solar radiation, minimize energy consumption, minimize material use, minimize time of construction. Like so, all of these are kind of engineering optimizations, and also it's not just singular use. Even in engineering, there are multiple objectives, often conflicting. For example, like timber. Um, there's an increasing use of timber and interest in timber. Why? Because um, timber trees store carbon, right? Like so, even when you cut them and use them in a building, they're storing carbon. Whereas any other material, like as soon as you take it out of the earth, it releases carbon, right? Like so, so there's a huge benefit in that sense with timber, that it doesn't release new carbon into the atmosphere, and that, as we all know, is beneficial for the climate control, at least in some sense. So, so in that sense, you want your buildings to have as much carbon storage as possible, which means you want to use as much timber as possible in your in your building. So that's why it's called mass timber, right? Like very massive sections of timber. But on the other hand, like the heavier, more timber you use, the heavier the building is. And that's going to use more energy to heat and cool, and like even make the building. You have to lift all of this heavy stuff hundreds of meters up in the air. So now this is a trade-off, right? Like on the one hand, you want to store as much timber as much carbon as possible, so the building wants to be as fat as possible. And the other hand, like it wants to be as thin as possible, because you don't want like to use too much. So there it's like a multi-objective optimization, right? Like where you want to balance like two things. And similarly, there can be many others. Like you also want to balance construction time. So many times, some techniques take more time to construct than others. So in an engineering sense, that's what optimization means, like balancing many objectives, right? Like so, and optimization like somehow has this connotation that like you're achieving a maximum or minimum. But in most common use of optimization in practice and in technological use is to achieve some kind of trade-off, like a balance. And in architectural terms, like in the built environment, obviously, as you said, like architecture is not just about optimization of certain objectives, but it is definitely a language of trade-off, right? Like like even a social contract like that all architecture has, right? Like so we have a contract with our end users. Like as architects, we are serving our end users, so we have an implicit social contract with the end users. So now, so you obviously then have to make choices, right? Like you have to want to keep the most people happy most of the time, but all of the people won't be happy all of the time. So now there is a trade-off, right? Like so, um, so that's what that's what we tend to mean by architecture is a negotiation of trade-offs. Many times you have to negotiate between the desires of the person paying, right? Like your client. It could be the city, it could be the government, but somebody's paying you. And but like your end user is is requiring certain um, you want to make beautiful spaces for them, like so they have a good experience, or and also you want to use as little material as possible, so that um, environmentally we are conservative, and so on. So there is a trade-off there, right? Like between people who want to pay and people who want to consume. So there's a trade-off between production and consumption, and so almost everything in architecture is a balancing act. At every stage, it's a balancing act between technology, between environment, between users. So broadly speaking, that's what we mean by optimization. I mean, generally speaking, I don't use the word optimization except when I do mean optimization in a mathematical sense. And mathematical sense also is not a single objective optimization. It is multiple objectives. So, for example, like if you're a swimmer, you 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 want to optimize your lung capacity, and also your body gets optimized for a certain activity, right? Like so that's where you can say optimization. But when it comes to architecture, we generally say trade-offs, negotiation, um, and so these words of equivalence, right? Like that, which which is always the case. Like even because there is no infinite resource, so there's always going to be trade-offs. Yeah. So I hope that gives you a broad understanding of what potentially optimization could mean, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Shige.
Hey,
Yeah.
Bowen.
Yeah. I want to I get some ideas of the optimization.
Mm-hmm.
Like so many years ago, I used the robotic to do the hot wire cutting, and at that
Mm-hmm.
time, we always used the one single wire to cut the road surface,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe 1 year later or 2 years later, like the articles, and they invent like the I don't know, it's a wire or a metal stick and to
Mm-hmm.
curve the double curved and a complex surface.
Mm-hmm.
And this year, and like the ETH Zurich and like the Philip Block, they use the like the fabric forming, like the
Mm-hmm.
some flexible modes to use like the silicon membrane to make less waste in the construction. I think that
Mm-hmm.
is maybe I think this is another optimization in construction. I think the
Mm-hmm.
optimization is a double curve. It's a double waste from the design and from the construction,
Mm-hmm.
and they maybe find a balanced point in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also yeah, that's another aspect of so-called optimization, right? I mean, it's again a trade-off, like it's negotiating between structural geometry and spatial geometry, right? Like so for example, like oftentimes there is like so-called structural shape, shapes that are structurally better, like like human bodies, like some bodies are more athletic, which and the bone structure is evolved and um, to do certain kind of structural things that our bodies can do, right? Like so, or four-legged animals can do certain other things. They can run much faster than humans, and so there is such a thing as a appropriate shape for the given structural use, right? Like so, if you want to if you even for robots, if you want to make a robot that can climb a wall, you'll probably design it to have a different body than the one if you wanted to swim in the ocean, right? And I mean, of course, our bodies are remarkable in the sense that like we can do many things. We can go in the ocean and we can also climb walls. But nonetheless, our shapes, our bodies are adapted, right? So that's another word that I would use more than optimization is like adapted to use, and also evolved, right? Like that's another relevant word, different to optimization. Like if you evolve something, it's obviously naturally adapted to the given environment. So a structural shape can be evolved or can be adapted to the given force condition, right? So if you, there's this famous example that fishes that are deeper in the ocean, they're rounder because there is more pressure, there's more water pressure, so they become inflated. And if they're higher up in the, they live closer to the surface of the water, there's less pressure and therefore they're less rounded. So things like this. So there's this shape, there's a relationship between shape and structure that's undeniable. Similarly, there is a relationship between shape and what users can do in that shape, right? Like in that space. So there's a reason why auditoriums are the way they are, and like every, so acoustically it performs a certain way. There's a reason why you know, stadiums are the way they are, and towers are the way they are, etc. So yeah, you often have to balance structural shape with like architectural shape. And there's also construction shape, right? Like, so shapes that are easier to construct, without doubt. Like some things are easier to construct, but that doesn't mean that like we should privilege any one of these, right? So we have to somehow balance what shapes are easiest to construct. Well, right now it's easiest to construct a box. Why? Because for 100 years, like, we have been constructing boxes. So everybody knows how to make a box, and so there's like a full factory setup, supply setup to make boxes. So that's so that's what, like, the examples you mentioned, Bowen, are trying to challenge. For hundreds of years, it's way too easy to build a box, but we know a box is not structurally better. It is better for construction from the point of view of easy to construct, for sure. But it is not better structurally, and it's clearly not better spatially, because who wants to live in a box? Nobody. Uh, and 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 so, I mean, you can see that, like, in the AA, the old buildings are so much more valued. Why? Because it's taller, there's texture, there's like interesting spaces, like and so, yeah. So there's this dance, let's say. You have to negotiate between what is easiest to construct, what is structurally adapted, and what is spatially interesting. So the examples you meant, the fabric formwork, hot wire cutting, etc., it's trying to challenge hundreds of years of construction methodology, to say, like, there's a better way to build shape, which are structurally aligned, or structurally better, structurally adapted, and spatially interesting. And now increasingly also easier to build. Like, you know, like the example for everybody to see, the one that Bowen was mentioning. Let's see. Um, yeah, is this one? We just stretch fabric. Can you see?
Yeah, yeah, I can see.
Yeah, yeah. So we stretch fabric and then cast concrete, like, and you can see it is super thin concrete. You skip through it. Yeah, it's very, very thin. It's 5 centimeters worth of concrete. And so we are challenging old ways of doing, and we are also suggesting that, like, this kind of curved geometry is is structurally better, and obviously it's spatially interesting because there's always an inside and an outside. So there's the outside is the cement, and inside there's all of this colorful texture, which is incidentally part of the way you construct it. It's not like added ornament later. It's just part of the way you make the formwork. So there's all of this spatial and structural and constructional integration, right? Like so, um, and typically, if you had to make these kind of geometries, like you would have to waste a lot of formwork, and so that's one way like that we are trying to show in this like little pavilion example, that you can try and integrate spatial, structural, and constructional aspects. So these lines are naturally part of the knitting machine. So it was produced using this knitting machine, right? This is a grandma's knitting machine, and not like you can buy it. And so it produced all of these rolls, 55 kilos, but many kilometers of knitted formwork, which was then stretched, as we saw here, and then we cast concrete to produce this. And what's interesting is that like all the material came through that little door over there, right? This structure we didn't bring it, and this is 6 meters down in the ground, like this is a courtyard in a pit, and everything came in through that little door. So this also in a way like what you could say is optimized, but it's actually a negotiation of many different parameters, many different aspects: construction, um, structural shape, and this is a very strong shape. It is because of its curvature. You can see like this curved object, it has curvature everywhere, like in all directions. So it's obviously going to be much stronger than something that doesn't have curvature, and that's why we can build such a relatively large structure for very thin material, thin concrete. It's like less than 5 centimeters of concrete in some areas. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Shajay.
Yeah. Hey.
I had a question.
Yeah, sure.
I think personally, like architecture, DLL, I think is a sort of framework to respond to challenges of today. And like one example of challenges of today could be like the fact that we are living in a transitional era from like mass production to customization production. And I think in that sense, like participatory design becomes important.
Yeah.
And I would like to know your opinion on how participatory design method is utilized in our current built environment, and sort of what computational tool is used to tackle those challenges.
Yeah. I think like yeah, it's a good point. Like participation. First of all, what do we mean by participation, right? Like first and foremost, it means that we have some say in the built environment. Like we as citizens have some say, not just as architects. Like so, so if let's say you're not an architect, like cities just happen to you, right? Like you have zero say in anything, like any building that goes up next to you, or even kilometers of like construction that happen, like you have zero say in it. But like the resources that are getting consumed are resources of your planet, like and also it's every building that is built is going to affect you, right? Without that, whether you actually use it or not, like just the fact that you have to look at it already impacts you, right? And so that's one of the things is agency. We speak a lot about agencies, like how do you how can you use your skills? uh, Obviously all of you are going to be or already exceptionally skilled when you come into the DRL, and by the time you leave you will be like some other set of people, like like completely transformed, and even more skilled, and more aware, more able. How will you use this skill and knowledge to do good things in the world, right? Like, and by good things is not just like doing charitable things, like it means like really have an impact in um, transforming or so-called providing a revolutionary use value, right? How will you provide these technologies that like you will learn game technologies, you will know robotics, you will know Arduinos, you will know all these optimization tools, etc., etc., etc. Like, how will you make use of them in a revolutionary way? Like, and revolutionary in the sense, how will you make the benefits of these technologies and these ideas be more impactful, more widely felt? And one of the things that we've been interested in is game technologies, and how that can genuinely impact the larger built environment. And so one great example of that is like Minecraft. How many of you know of Minecraft? Right, it's like a game engine that typically lots of kids play, and it's very super easy to use. But they've been using this as participatory means to build villages and other things in Africa for more than 8-9 years now. So Minecraft is maybe a decade old, and so let's see if I can find that. Let me share. It's called Block by Block, and share the screen now. Can you all see?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So you see, like this is it's like Lego, clearly, but used to empower communities to basically have a revolutionary use value. And look, these are not architects, by the way. These are like kids and people in Africa, in India, in yeah, there was a project in Nepal after the earthquake. They used this kind of digital technology to communicate to basically show to people of the community um, how their community can be rebuilt physically and spatially, and that gives us enormous hope that 3D technologies is not necessarily only for architects, right? Most people understand 3D better than they can understand 2D drawings. Um, so that's one of the means of conferring or attributing revolutionary use value to some of the technologies that we know is this. Like, we clearly know how to use game engines to make cool things like render stuff and so on. Like, we can, with a little bit more effort, extend it to literally as a means of building new communities. And that's one of the things that we were particularly interested in the last year, but also previously, uh, to develop like a participatory means to engage in design, um, design decision making, but even if it is not decision making, it is about at least having a, a wide diversity of opinion, and that's very, very important, right? Like, if you like, that's why I'm asking, for example, you guys also, if there are 40 people and all of them will definitely have a diverse opinion range, and so and then we come to a negotiated understanding of what is the best or better way to do stuff. And that's, so there are these three aspects of participatory um, design that is very, very very much at the heart of customization. It's not just because I want a funky phone, or I just want like some custom logo on my T-shirt or something, but like it's actually collective intelligence, um, right? So many wisdom of the crowd, for example. That's another way to think um, of participation. Like so, so for example, if I were to ask you, each one of you, how much does what is the temperature outside in London today, right? All of you, all of you might get it wrong. Most likely you will get it wrong. Like individually, you will get it wrong. But if I take an average of all your guesses, it will be almost accurate to a fraction of the real value. So that's like I mean, this is a crucial discovery of the intelligence of animals in a crowd, right? Like that's why uh, um, that's why animals tend to flock. That's why animals tend to live in societies of like like even human, if you consider humans as animals, that we tend to live in societies because collectively we can make better guesses. And 99.99% of our lives is making guess, right? Like we don't know actually what we are going to do next, if we're going but like we make guesses. Collectively we make guesses, and that's why we tend to follow what other people do. Makes sense, because if you follow what others are doing, to some extent, like then it may actually save your life, right? Obviously not always. Sometimes if you blindly follow things like a sheep, like you might end up in a ditch. But there is a collective intelligence aspect to participation, and this obviously then also means like the resources of the community are best spent well, right? Like, so it's not decided by one person, it's not decided by one mayor who says, oh, okay, I'm gonna put $5 billion on like a thing that is useful for three people, right? That's not gonna happen if you have genuine participation. And this has been tried in like many places like Brazil, like so-called participatory governance, uh, which where citizens can participate in the budgetary decisions of the city. So they collectively decide how much it will be spent on what, right? So that's another huge aspect like of the built environment, why participation is important. There are 800 or so cities that India itself is going to build in the next 20 years, right? 800. And world over, there will be like 2 billion more people who are going to live in cities. Cities are being built like at an unbelievable rate, and they're being built without your voice. And you can clearly imagine like how much waste of resource or misallocation of resource is going to happen, because some politician somewhere is going to decide that like we need a city, and it's going to be built. Whereas if you build it in this kind of participatory way, yeah, cities need to be built because we all need to live somewhere. Um, but they can be built in a better way through public participation, through agency, and through the use of these new technologies, right? Like why are we building all these cities in the same way as we have been for the last 100 years? Why not build them the way they were built like 200 years ago? Like build them like that, but with newer technology, better technology. And why not improve that? Because we all love the cities that were built 200 years ago. There's no doubt about that, right? Like, if you want to take a holiday, I will take the bet that most of you will go to, older cities or to the beach. So that's definitely part of this agenda of DRL in general, is called social ecologies. Um, so we definitely are interested in game technologies and how they can be expanded to invite participation from non-experts, which is clearly a necessity, and everybody knows that this is beneficial, and lots of examples of successful stories in that sense. Like,
Okay.
hey, Jonathan. Yeah.
Hey, can I just ask one question? Sorry.
Sure.
If we are like, let's say if we're building a community in Africa, like using Minecraft, how much responsibility should be given to the community to design? Because surely, like, architects has a better knowledge in architecture and like spaces. So,
Sure.
what are the balance of responsibility between the community and architect?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and you can extend this question in any generic way to it's basically a question of intelligence, right? Like, where do you distribute? How do you distribute the intelligence? Do you want to distribute it like 90% into experts and like 10% into non-experts, and or 50-50, or 10% 90%? Like that, we don't know. Everything will depend on the specifics of the case, but the idea that there can be some mix is already better than zero mix, right? Like right now, communities have zero say, and you can think of this question in the design of robots as well, right? If you're making a robot, are you going to mimic the human brain? I mean, no, or are you going to have a central computer that takes all decisions, or you're going to have like a swarm of like little robots which are individually not so intelligent, but collectively they might survive longer, right? Collectively they might actually do better, right? Like, so but having said, like, so these are questions, these are open questions without any definitive answer. Like, how much is a matter of experimentation. So you set up an experiment where there's zero community involvement and 100% engineered, I mean, 100% architect designed community, and then see what happens. And then you introduce 10% of community involvement, and then 90% architect. Um, and this is literally how all decisions are made at even at the city scale, right? Like, you always have these pilot villages or pilot projects where you do these experiments and then define the answer. So there was this example in Brazil, on Porto Alegre, where they decided that like part of their city's budget, a part, not all, I don't know what, 5% of the budget was going to be decided by all the citizens. No, they could have said like 50% will be decided by citizens, but like at least they made some experiment. So that's how you do. That's how you will find out the answer, by constructing experiments, and figuring out the answers in that way. So, for example, economics works like this: like, um, how much tax should the government get from its citizens? Well, it's not a fixed number. You make an experiment and then see if people pay it or not. If they stop paying it, like, then that's too much. So So you can extend this to anything. Like you can also extend it to like painting and art, and like so. Um, yeah, like let me show you an example of community-based intelligence like that. They're using this to teach robots to solve problems collectively. Um, yeah.
I would like to continue maybe the discussion that Nick just raised. If I understand right, also the past as well, like that's building by buildings in Italy and also in France were designed by like groups that they designed their own building and their own quarter and stuff. And I mean, what I want to ask, if you think that this knowledge can be somehow digitalized, like you could teach the computer to think like a European city planner in one day, to parameterize like the street section, the pedestrian section, the quarters, the diversity, the level of participatory, the decision level of the architects, or to divide buildings to the architect. Because also I had a talk with one of the friends here in the DRL. For example, we had this Maya tutorial, and Maria told us like, this can be a sculpture and a master plan together. And it's in a jump in scale that is in a total contradiction to everything that architecture design suggests in the previous century. So I ask if you think this can be, this knowledge that we accumulated can be somehow digitalized.
Yes. Question is, do you want to digitize knowledge that has been accumulated? That's the equivalent of digitizing a dictionary. So obviously there's use to a dictionary, but at the same time, do you want to digitize or through simulation discover the principles by which such cities came to be? Right? Like how did they grow to be like this? How did they become? Because that's what we want to know. Because like our problems of the 21st century are nowhere like the problems of the 18th and 19th century, right? Like we have very different problems. Like the world is like much more populated, like a lot more economic production. I mean, we eat more, we live more, I mean, there's just generally a scale of problem that is significantly different. So in that sense, using a 200-year-old dictionary is not going to help us that much, but we can use it as a resource to say, how did these cities adapt? And so that's where we can use computational technologies like AI or game or like whatever. To how many of you have seen this example in video? It's like a very cute research from OpenAI, which I find like fascinating. Like it's just that, you know,
They learn, they are trained actually.
yeah, exactly. They train and they learn to cooperate, and they find out like all kinds of weird strategies to. So the red agents have to find the blue agents, and look at the blue agents. They're putting all the boxes next to the door, like children, and preventing the red people. And like the red one, like somewhere learns that you can put a ladder and climb over. And like, so these are like fascinating discoveries, right? Like by just setting up an experiment in a way to see, and a lot of the strategies that these discover are like typical strategies that like humans have discovered over many centuries in playing hide and seek, right? So that's a simple game, seekers and hiders, and you can see the game is like relatively simple. Like, I mean, the graphics are cute, but the game actually is rather simple. um, and so that's what I would say, like, or like my way to think about European cities or Chinese cities or Indian cities or Mayan cities, etc., is that is to think of how they came to be. How did they discover the principles, rather than just use the principles as a dictionary, if that makes sense. So it's that is the power of the computer to simulate. I mean, this is not a real world simulation, obviously, like, but it's sufficiently real world that it gives you insight. It allows you to really to understand, like, what are the principles behind hide and seek. Look at this one. And so we can use similar technologies to say what are the principles behind um, city building, what are the principles behind um, community intelligence, and so on. So yeah, it's not so much that, like, I believe that European cities are somehow better. I think all cities, even New York, has some like extraordinary things that like they've achieved, that it has adapted and survived. It's not historic. It's mostly built in the 20th century, but it's also a remarkable city, right? Like that, like it has adapted to new change. Whereas San Francisco, for example, is like not so great because it's like already in 20 years, like it's like dying. Um, so yeah, so it's like, how can you discover the principles of adaptation, principles of survival, principles of resilience through simulation? Yeah.
If I may add a few opinion.
Yeah.
One quick response to the Minecraft platform is I actually read about a article that's saying somebody built a uncensored library using the Minecraft platform, which is a collection of all the censored articles or information around the world, which I think is quite interesting because it's sort of like a materialization of the decentralized or the group intelligence kind of idea. And secondly is I think when coming to asking what aspects there are in computation design, I think other than like geometry optimization or structural optimization, there's also, I think, a possibility is the optimization of programs, which I think there are also research cases of like optimizing floor plans with AI, like depending on the relationship or the intimacy of programs, they can arrange a optimized platform. I guess my question, there are two questions in mind. I think first is, because this AI kind of aided optimization is still kind of like a top to bottom resolution, I guess. And so what do you see in comparison to the bottom up participatory way? Is there a connection between them, or is it like a totally different thing? And I think the second question is, when we're talking about program in computational design, is there a relation, like a strong relation to the optimized geometry? Like, does it affect each other in any way, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, two related questions and thoughts there. One is one is about, you know, which form of intelligence to apply to a given problem. So, I mean, obviously, AI technologies like the ones developing by Google and Facebook and so on are super powerful. Like, I mean, those are centralized AI, right? It's one big supercomputer that does collects like millions and billions of um, data points and then finds patterns in it. Clearly, super useful in running efficient networks. Like, so you get the information you want in like less than whatever nanosecond, you know, so that's clearly a benefit. um, so, and if you use a decentralized intelligence model where there is no central big computer, but they're like tiny billions of small computers decentralized across the world, then that's a different intelligence model, and it may or may not have like, I mean, it will have its own opportunities and benefits. For one, the decentralized one will be more resilient, so you can't take out a central server and like all of the knowledge is gone. I mean, even Google, like, even though they control all the servers, like their servers are indeed distributed across the world, so you can't like take out Google by taking out one of their data centers, right? Like, so that so there is a resiliency built into the decentralized model that you can't shut down. And so that's, I guess that's also relates to your Minecraft example of all the censored stuff. Like, if you take out one server, like, and it can easily be transferred to another, right? It's like past the parcel, like, you know, many animals have this, you just pass it along, and so then you don't have it. um, yeah, so, you know, which model to use is again, as I said to Cholong, is a matter of experimentation. So, and there's no clear cut answer that like top down is better than bottom up. Like, that simply isn't the case. You know, like, so a rather rudimentary anecdotal example, you know, let's take Uber. Uber is the ultimate example of a centralized AI. Like, Uber knows literally at every second how many cars are where, what is the demand in every part of the city at any given time. So that is the definition of centralized AI. And Uber is able to set prices, surge pricing, or like, or opposite, is able to give you discounts when it thinks necessary to encourage you. So, and then there's the opposite one. Like, I think it's called ride, no, something like this. Anyway, so there, where the driver set the price. So that's a decentralized model. Like, so if I'm a driver in, let's say, central London, I set the price. And if I'm a driver like in rural Kent, like, I set the price. So obviously, I know knowledge of the local conditions, right? If it's raining, or like if it like there's a major road disruption, etc., I know it more instantly. But the drivers have no global idea of like what's happening in London. And so both models have their pluses and minuses. Like, I mean, even though it is just a simple example of ride sharing apps, but the same can be extended to many, like the built environment. Like, you know, should you build roads? You can ask the question, should there be a master plan of road building, or everybody just builds roads wherever they think it's necessary? What do you guys think? What if, like, I just decide, like, community wise, this community decides that there needs to be a road here, and they build a road?
From my experience from Greek villages, let's say that it happens in that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Less.
And is that a disaster?
Yeah,
Or things actually work?
it actually is. I think that. Can I say a general thing before answering? Actually,
Yeah, sure. Go on.
There was a Greek philosopher educated in France in the 60s who I remember a phrase that he used to say. It was that animals are many times far more rational than people are, because animals won't do anything that will harm them, that will harm their race or their, I don't know. So they seem to be able to take far more rational decisions for what is good or bad, simply like that. So people, what worries me most with this in this discussion that we have is that there is also with people there's something like collective silliness also many times, which is has to do with all these different little different desires that all the people have. And so in my experience with the Greek philosophy, what happens many times is that they actually build in a way that the man that has more power in the village, his own fields are not harmed, for example.
Sure.
So you just built in what the most powerful people is more convenient or efficient. I don't know.
Yes, that's very much true. It's like the counter possibility that like of collective intelligence is collective harm. Um, and that's not only restricted to humans. I mean, animals also do collective harm, because sometimes, like, there's this like famous swarming ant example. Because they swarm, they rely on the chemicals that other ants leave. So if one of the ants goes into a kind of death spiral, like so under certain conditions, so there's these National Geographic videos you can see where for days and days, ants go in circles, like millions of ants. They go in circles until all of them die. It's just like crazy. Like you would think like they will break out of this trance, but they don't. It's called the death trance of ants, and they. So it's very similar to what humans might do, and that is related to a lack of awareness of like the global condition, right? So because every ant is only looking at like their own immediate gains or surroundings, and the strongest opinion in that region will win. And so it can so happen that like collectively it can lead to disastrous situations. But thankfully, we do know already now what are the conditions under which such things will happen. What are the conditions under which collective intelligence will fail? And one criteria that is almost necessary by definition for collective intelligence to work is a diversity of opinions. So there need to be very strong opinions about very, very diametrically opposite positions. So it's going back to the guessing example. So the famous example for collective intelligence is it was discovered by this statistician called Francis Galton, and he asked. So there was apparently a village game where people have to guess the weight of a cow or something, and the person guessing the closest to the actual weight gets the cow. And turns out that he discovered that whilst the person winning came closest to the actual weight, the average of all guesses came much, much, much closer to the right weight. And that is because there were very, very many wild guesses on both sides, which kind of averaged out. Like some guessed it was too thin, and some guessed it was too fat. And so this is one criteria that is almost necessary by definition for collective intelligence to work, which is that there should be a diversity of opinion. And regardless of how ludicrous each of the opinions is, you still need to have it so that you can operate somewhere in the middle. So that's one, and the other is that like there should not be external coercion of making people follow things like you by use of force. It has to be all voluntary, right? Like so in your Greek example, like the boss cannot be coercing others to follow whatever they say. So everybody needs to have an independence of action. And the third important criteria is that everybody has only a little bit of agency, has only a one vote or a little say. Not like there are no veto rights, right? Like so, there shouldn't be anybody who can overrule anybody. So at least these three conditions have to be there, but that for good, effective collective intelligence to work. I mean, and obviously it doesn't always work, like as you said. That's one. And then there are also conditions like the Uber example that I mentioned, or the Google example, where a centralized AI is much better. So if you have an earthquake and stuff, like you need both. Like you need like the centralized satellites that can coordinate globally, and then you also need like the people on the ground, like figuring things out and taking decisions there. And so yeah, so it's always almost always invariably a mixture. What exact percentage mixture it is it depends on the experiment and depends on the context and so on. So going back to the road building example, yeah, there is no reason to believe that like it will lead to chaos, but there will be conditions under which it will lead to chaos. Um, and the same way, like centralized planning might work in some cases, but in other cases it might actually not work, right? So it's definitely finding the balance for a given situation. So there's no universal rules of balancing central top-down intelligence versus, I mean, also think of it in a team. That's why it's all important to have like more opinions, diverse range of opinions in a team. And anecdotally, in the last 15 years that I've noticed in the DRL, the best performing teams are the ones that constantly seem to be fighting. Like they never seem to get along, but somehow magically their project is benefiting. So that, yeah, so that's the, but then also their teams that like so dysfunctional that like they kind of do self-harm. So yeah, that's also, yeah, so we just have to manage based on the cards that you're dealt with. So any other
questions?
Yes.
Okay, we have think about the how to use the technique to create a special prototype and use the prototype, use the agency to develop it. But in the design practice, such as when we create the minimum surface, but when we transform it into the design practice, such as the National Titan Theater, which is designed by Toyo Ito. But I think is more focused on the prototype rather than the city and the urbanism and the context and even the user. So how do we deal with the relationship between the context of the urbanism and the prototype and make it to guide our design strategy?
Um, yeah, so the like Taichung Opera House or any of these like big buildings, like they serve many purpose. Right? One of the more main purpose that they serve is also as a hub of innovation, right? Like so, the society, these buildings cost a lot of money, and society is putting its resources to make this building. And so, like airport and like so these buildings like they have to be aspirational. They have to in many ways be unique, um, because they're unique buildings, like because the context in which they are is unique, meaning they're a big building, they have a lot of budget, and there's lots of people in kind of really want to use that building and so on. So I think it's difficult for this building to just blend in seamlessly with the surrounding context, which is perhaps like built like in a different time. Um, so one of the things that like we always think about um, how to blend the building with the context or with the user is to think about it um, from the current user and the current context perspective, not like what has been built like 30, 50, 200 years ago. So what that means is that like you kind of want to create spaces that are relevant to contemporary times. For example, in a contemporary city like um, there is no clear division between live, work, play. It's a 24/7 city, right? Like and so you want spaces to be also flexible in this way. Like I mean, not to say that walls need to move, but it is not like there is an auditorium and then there is a kitchen and then there is a cafe and then there is a reading hall, etc. Right? That's like a 20th century way to think that there is one room for each program, but increasingly, like the same room or space has to do many more things. Sometimes it has to be a library and a relaxing place, and in the nighttime it can be turned into a gym, into a club, etc. Right? Like so, there are these kind of contemporary conditions that you have to address with your architecture, and that's what makes it blended with the users. If it's aligned with the way the current culture is using spaces. So that's one, and then so these minimal surfaces, they're structurally better, right? Like because they're they're called minimal because they're minimal stress, which means they're minimal. They transfer forces to the ground very easily. So they can be very thin. Like an eggshell is a minimal surface not in the shape, but like that it can transfer forces along the surface very easily. So you can have very thin eggshells, and or a Pringle chips. That's a saddle shape, which is a minimal surface, and that can carry a lot of weight for how thin it is. So so how do you use these structurally beneficial shapes? That's where the skill of the architect comes. How can you use these beneficial structural shapes on the one hand and make it fit with the contemporary use of spaces that people, like in a lecture, like most people are not 100% listening to a lecture anymore, right? Like you listen sometimes and then like you want to hang out at the back and go to drink some have a different conversation and come back into the middle, etc. So there's a very different use of a lecture hall now than 20, 30, 100 years ago. So definitely that's the skill of an architect now is how can you negotiate all these aspects. Like on the one hand, you want to use structurally effective shapes so you don't use more material than needed. Yeah, but at the same time, you want to address the contemporary use of space by users of today, and so on. So yeah, that's what I would say. Like, generally, I tend to not worry about like how the building looks. More importantly, is it rational in terms of its use of materials? Is it beautiful and experientially joyful for the end users? Because in the end, you want things to be not only practical but also like have the music component to it, right? Like you need to be able to, uh, users should feel happy in your buildings. So you have to marry these aspects, and so it's, yeah. There's no straightforward answer to this. Like the only way you can negotiate, only way you can come at an answer is to do many experiments. So you do and you test, you do and you test, you do and you test, and then you will develop something that answers many questions. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me maybe just go through a few slides more, and then so we said about architecture, language, and geometry, and as as I said just now, to answer to you, Fan, architecture is a lot like storytelling. In the one hand, like in this movie, whenever you're watching a movie, particularly a computer animated movie, you're not actually thinking of all the technology that goes into how to simulate the snow, how do you simulate the light, how do you simulate the hair. You're focusing on what is this um, deer saying and what is this person saying, and like you're like really interested in the storytelling. But behind the scenes, there are like thousands and thousands of PhDs. Like there's one PhD for like every aspect that you see on the left, right? Snow, hair, fur, lighting, even drawing these shapes. So, when we're watching a movie, we're only concerned about the left side. But when you're making the movie, you have to be concerned about the right side as well. So, so you can think of it like in that way. Like architecture is similar. When the user is experiencing the space, they care zero about your technology, right? Like they don't care whether it was made by a robot, it was made by humans. They just don't care. What they care is like how are they experiencing the space and how useful the spaces are for them, for their lives, etc. And and historic architecture is also similar, right? Like when you go to this building on the left, like Sagrada Familia, you are not worried about like how they calculated the structure. You're worried about, you're not worried, you're concerned about the lighting, you're like concerned about the experience, how amazing it is, and the acoustics, etc. You zero concerned about like, will the stone fall on my head, right? That is not your concern as a user. But as a architect, as an engineer, obviously you have to be concerned if the stone is going to fall down. And so again, that's why one architecture is such a beautiful profession and a discipline, like because it has storytelling aspects, it has technical aspects, it has participatory aspects, and so many things. Like so, their production and consumption of architecture, and that makes it like really part of and the seminar will show you how geometry is at the heart of both the left side and the right side, and how you can how you can manipulate geometry to achieve storytelling aspects, achieve production aspects, right? So that's one of the main topics that we will cover. And then we'll also address the idea of the thing that we were saying, that geometry as it is conceived now is actually quite expensive to make physically. Even though these are structurally efficient and so on, how do you make it less expensive? And that's where robotic technologies come into play. These technologies really make these shapes a lot cheaper to make. That's where a lot of these new businesses make it possible to construct locally. So we are exploring ideas and projects where you import only the machines, just these two robots, and you use local timber to build everything. Right, so that's gonna make it cheaper, obviously, and so on. So that's another aspect we will address. And then it's also digitally quite expensive to make. Can anybody comment on why you think like digitally it's expensive to create these kind of shapes? We know physically it's expensive because like there's no industry yet to set up to create these shapes, but that's being addressed. Digitally it's expensive. So, if you ask a designer to make a box, they can do it for cheaper and quicker than if you ask them to design these curved ones. Why do you think that is?
Maybe the programming aspect of it, that it's not really very popular right now, so only some people are able to do that right now in the field, right?
For example, yeah, that is one aspect that you need to acquire these new skills. Like a doctor, like a neurosurgeon is obviously more expensive than a general physician because they have to acquire new skills. And that's obviously going to will be reflected in how much time it's going to take to design a building or anything, any architecture that is incorporating these new technologies. So obviously modernist buildings are going to be cheaper to design because you already know the dictionary, so you just look up like one of these books and everything is done. So from going from sketch to building is very easy in a modernist building because we have been doing it for hundreds of years. But it's very difficult if you now even if you draw St. Paul's Cathedral, how will you build it? Like there's no knowledge in the society to build that. So you have to reinvent a lot of things with robots and so on. And so that's going to make it expensive. So how do you address that? How will you make that part cheaper?
I think either you teach new people the skills or you are more open sourcing the new dictionary.
Yeah, exactly. Both. All of the above. So, yes, the more we all learn, the cheaper it's going to get. And the more open source it is, the cheaper it's going to get. And one way to make it open source is to put it in a game engine. Right. So non-architects will also start looking into it, right? There's no reason why Minecraft needs to look the way it does. And yeah, so that's so that's definitely an aspect. Like, so how do you acquire knowledge and then like distribute it, right? And so that's a key aspect of making it cheaper. And also, things like Grasshopper, and all these tools, they're part of this ecosystem of making things more widely available. Like, I mean, that's why I say Grasshopper started maybe 10 years ago, right? So, but all of the knowledge was there before. It's just things like Grasshopper happened 10 years ago, and now, like, literally you can access lots of these state-of-the-art things anywhere in the world. And that's um, so that's a crucial message, that because it is knowledge, it can be applied equally in low tech environments or high tech environments, and it literally doesn't matter. Um, so, for example, let me share this one. We did a gallery for mathematics. This is in like the heart of London, very high budget project, and so on. And but it's exactly the same technology for a school, in for refugee children. And we were able to design and deploy in a matter of 2 months, because we were doing the other project alongside this one, because one project benefits the other. And so it's literally the same idea, that like you stretch fabric, and then it's actually these kind of curved shapes are cooler inside, because the sun is not exposed to all parts of the surface at the same time, and so on. And it was easy to make, and it was we were able to make it in a matter of like a couple of months, start to finish, etc. So there is that aspect to making things cheaper. That So knowledge creation was subsidized by like this project, so we were able to then distribute it to other projects. And similarly, we proposed a school in rural China. It's using ceramic tiles and rather simple geometries, using somewhat more ancient techniques of construction, like walled building and so on. Again, easier to build, and also cooler, because like if you have ever been under a vault, you will instantly know that this is cooler, temperature wise, because it's taller space. And then also you can see in this render already, like half of the side is always in the shade, right? Like, so this part is not exposed, for example. And so that's an important feature of curved geometry, is that solar exposure is typically a lot less. So yeah. So we can, yeah. So these are some of the topics that we will cover in the seminar, like some technical, some wide-ranging architectural impact. So yeah, and the readings are, they're not, usually they won't be technical. They're relatively easy to understand and read. Yeah. So by next time, if you read them, read those, and also watch the videos that I'm gonna upload. It will summarize various discussions we've had today, including participatory design, collective intelligence, how to mix end user experience with structural optimization, or I mean, what is it even optimal, and all of these aspects. Yeah. Yeah. So, any concluding questions, thoughts? Hey, Stefan.
I think I'll ask one general question. I'm not sure if you covered this in the start because I was like 5 minutes late. Is there a specific topic for the final essay?
Yes. The topics will the specific topics are these headlines that I mentioned, like what is that architectural geometry is currently expensive, or how do you make it cheaper? What are the benefit, any of these main headlines of like how do you incorporate architectural geometry within a participatory mechanism, um, uh, or it could be technical even, like it could be about a case study of a specific construction project, but digest that into um, useful useful from a design perspective, right? Like, so your essay should not be only descriptive of like some other project, but it should be analytical. It's like analytical in the sense that it should be useful to design something in the future, or it should be useful to understand something like the built environment. So they should have a insight. But we will have like the last two sessions, like, so there will be eight sessions, and the last two we will cover specifically on the topics for writing essay, and then also some tips and tricks to write essays. Yeah, because it's not in my benefit at all to to read through 50 essays that are not considered. So I will help you write better essays so it's easier for me to read them. Yeah, any other? But I mean, I think like, writing is a means of being analytical, means of actually, you shouldn't see it as an essay. Particularly for those of you that English is not natural, they you might find it a bit hard to write, but you should focus less on the writing part, like more on the structured thinking part. So the language can be very, very simple. It can be, I always recommend use simple sentences, like no more than 20 words. Uh, um, even if you are like even if you have a degree in English, uh, don't use long sentences, because it's very difficult to communicate with long sentences. And then you should structure it. You should think in a structured way so that like the essay writes itself. So you have introduction, what is the central message, and what are the main points, the path to get to the conclusion, right? So these are called signposts in writing, and typically you have these sections that you write, the bullet points, and then you just fill in each of the sections. Like typically they're like 300 words each section. So an essay should have at least 8 to 10 signposts. So, and if you think about the signposts, like the essay writes itself, right? It's very easy to write once you have the 10 signposts. So it's basically then becomes connect the dots. And so that's how you should think about all essays, not just this seminar. Like even for the DAR seminar, you should think about signposts and fill in the blanks. And so that's why it's a good mental activity, right? You can be writing without literally writing. You can be writing in your mind, in the way you think. So it's like things have to make sense in as simple a way as possible with these headlines. What I mean by signposts, if you notice, even for presentations, I recommend this to at least all our students. You see, I have these pause slides like this one, that one. You notice AG is better, AG is practice compatible, AG is expensive, AG is expensive digitally. Why? AG is better and it's getting cheaper. Geometry for all, and like, so, these big headlines already, then I know what to, it's very easy to fill in like these 10 slides. And sometimes it's 3 slides, sometimes it's like 4 slides. And now I can write a paper out of this like very easily because I have a visual memory of what I want to write. Right. So I would say that should be the trick that all of you should be using is before you write, make a PowerPoint of your paper. Then it's very easy to write, like because you have a visual map of what you're writing about. And then it's very it literally feels like you're navigating to the end. So that's one of the tricks, at least, that I often use is collect a bunch of images that represent each of the sections. Okay, so so it will be a 3,000 word submission. And the last 2 sessions, we can discuss more specifics. And next week I will talk about curved origami from a geometric perspective, from an artistic perspective, from a computational perspective. So in the meantime, I will upload so I pre-recorded this entire presentation in 10 minutes chunks, and then I will upload it in the same section. So everybody has access to the Teams, right? Yeah. Okay. See you next week then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Welcome to.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.